Hello, I'm Nathan Laube, and I'm so delighted to welcome you back for today's final installment of this week-long recital from St. Matthew the Apostle Cathedral in Washington, D.C. Today, our final work in this program is by the famous French composer Charles-Marie Widor. It's the first movement of his celebrated Fifth Symphony for the organ in F, Opus 42, which you might say is the single work which has immortalized Widor among 19th century and early 20th century French composers. And that fame rests almost solely on the final movement of this symphony in 5 movements, the famous Toccata, the work which is the de facto postlude for Easter Sunday, which has accompanied countless brides down the aisle at their weddings, used for so many important celebrations. And while it's a justifiably famous and beloved work, the movement that I'm going to share with you today, the first movement of this particular symphony, the Allegro Vivace, a set of remarkably whimsical and ingenious variations, is one that owes a lot perhaps to Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy and especially Robert Schumann in its expressive language. In fact, if you know Schumann's symphonic etudes for the piano, a real monument of mid-19th century piano literature, the very last variation from that particular set of symphonic variations, just like Widor's, has a remarkably similar theme, full of energy, full of gusto, and again, a lot of character and whimsy. And so we can see Widor paying homage to these two important German musicians for whom he had a great respect in this particular work. It's also a piece that uses the organ, especially for Widor, in a somewhat unconventional way. He uses remarkably orchestral sonorities. For example, in the martial theme that opens the work, you can already hear him evoking a sort of woodwind quintet or something like this. Woodwinds versus strings, for example. In the first variation, we'll hear just the flute registers of the organ. In the third, the brass are finally introduced, again in a very martial character, juxtaposed with the legato texture of the strings. And then we have one of his most brilliant and virtuoso moments in all of his 10 organ symphonies, and that's his equivalent, you might say, of the famous Flight of the Bumblebee. And it uses, again, an unusual registration with a very virtuoso viola player in the left hand buzzing up and down the keyboard in dialogue with either pizzicato woodwinds and pizzicato bass in the pedal playing on offbeats in a very jagged sort of texture, which gives way, let's say, going from the most secular to the most sacred to the full foundations of the organ, momentarily bringing you into the cathedral for some sort of pious liturgical organ playing, evoking that gesture and that sonority. And then this gives way to the final scherzando, again reminding us of the opening theme on the woodwinds, but now in the distance. And then gradually, with a very dramatic crescendo, we arrive at the full tutti of the organ, hearing that opening theme now transformed in total splendor on the full resources of the instrument. There's no question why Widor's Fifth Symphony was among his most famous to perform and why it became such a favorite also for audiences. But the other thing I'd like to say about this piece is it brilliantly brings together so many of the compositions we've already heard in the course of the week. The organ on which probably this Fifth Symphony was initially heard, not yet in its completed form, but at least 3 movements, was the organ built in 1878 for the exhibition in Paris at the Trocadero. And if you recall from César Franck's Fantaisie en La that we heard on Tuesday, it was on this organ that a lot of seminal 19th century French compositions were first heard. Franck's Fantaisie en La, for example. Also, another composer we heard earlier in the week, it was Saint-Saëns who gave the French premiere of Liszt's most important organ work, his Fantaisie on Odd Nos. And it was Widor in the Trocadero, also in 1878, who premiered his Sixth Symphony in G minor, which incidentally was composed before his Fifth. And it was a year later, in 1879, that Widor at least played 3 of the movements from his new Fifth Symphony in F, including this one. So the Trocadero, you might say, not only was a catalyst for so much new composition, it was also a meeting place for all of French culture. This was also where one morning, as I also mentioned in the introduction to the Franck, that Aristide Cavaillé-Coll, the builder of that great organ, knocked on Widor's door and said, "Widor, come with me quickly to the Trocadero. Liszt is there waiting for us to hear my new organ. Can you play for him?" And of course, this was a great moment for Widor to play for Liszt. And then he asked Liszt if he would play for him. And Widor said that listening to Liszt play the piano for many hours was one of the most beautiful moments of his life. So the Trocadero organ, this new big four-manual organ in the capital of France, was a meeting point for so many people. It was a place of genesis for new composition. It was the place in which so many composers improvised and created music on the spot. And this is something really beautiful that is a byproduct of new organs and what they mean. And this is also probably going to be the same for St. Matthew's Cathedral, which has installed in our nation's capital a great new four-manual organ capable of rendering service to so much of our most beautiful repertoire. So much like the Trocadero, I hope that the organ at St. Matthew's will become a meeting place for artists, for musicians, for music lovers, where they can experience this great music in a wonderful setting. And I hope this is the case for years to come. And so with that, I thank you for joining me for this week of music coming to you from this beautiful Lively-Fulcher organ at St. Matthew's Cathedral. And I hope there will be many more opportunities for you to experience these wonderful sounds in that beautiful space played by musicians who love to explore them. So thank you again, and without further delay, I leave you with Widor's Allegro Vivace from his Symphony No. 5. Thanks so much.